Thank you very much for having me here to give this talk, and I hope you enjoy this. If you are familiar with work by scholars in the 20th century about Indian philosophy and its interaction with analytic philosophy, you might notice that the title of my paper is closely related to an issue that was raised by Karl Popper in epistemology when he investigated the question, does Indian epistemology concern the justified true belief theory of knowledge? And then in that paper, he carefully went through and diagnosed the relationship between what Indian epistemologists in the classical period were involved in and what was going on with contemporary debates, and then tried to talk about what relation could be obtained between the classical period and contemporary work. This was around the 1980s, actually, in analytic epistemology. So I'm sort of trying to be interested in the same thing. I'm interested in the relationship between what is going on in Indian philosophy of mind, in particular in the Vedanta schools, and whether or not that concerns the hard problem of consciousness as it's understood circa the 1990s and moving forward. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So I just like to start by saying what my theses are. Although there is a growth in the production of Vedantic theories that could be applied to the hard problem of consciousness in analytic philosophy, you can see that there is a volume of the Monists dedicated to this. I have a paper in it. It's by Janardhan Ganeri and Itay Shahani. I would say that Vedantic philosophy was not, however, Vedantic philosophy was not interested in this problem. It was interested in the hard problem of the self, something analytic philosophy is only discovering now. Neither Sankara nor Ramanuja's opposing theories of Vedanta are really appropriate for solving the hard problem of consciousness. However, Ramanuja's theory at least fits the frame of the hard problem of consciousness. Shankara's theory does not fit the frame, even if we can bend it to fit the frame. So in some sense, what I want to do is something that is very critical, actually, of my own early work, because I was actually a very big proponent of the view that we ought to be exploring Vedantic theories of consciousness as we explore the development of recent theories addressing the hard problem of consciousness. I still agree that that is the correct thing to be doing, but I think that we need to raise the bar of the level of engaging with our classical theories and making sure that we're actually getting the right details from them to apply them to the hard problem of consciousness. But in more specific detail, I want to advocate for the view that what we could kind of do instead is say that instead of applying our theories to the hard problem of consciousness, we could try to attract people from other traditions of philosophy to address the problem that actually the classical Indian philosophers were interested in, which I will call the hard problem of self. So I will contrast the hard problem of the self with the hard problem of consciousness and try to drive the literature going forward away from trying to build Indian theories that answer the hard problem of consciousness to drawing analytic philosophers and phenomenologists to the hard problem of the self, which is a problem well defined in Indian philosophy, and only recently something that analytic philosophers are coming to. And I'll explain how the analytic philosophers are carefully stumbling their way into this problem that was very clearly articulated early on and is very present in the Vedantic period, in the Vedantic traditions. Okay, so the outline will be what is the hard problem of consciousness and the definition of the terms it uses as understood in analytic philosophy, since it's an analytical problem. Then I want to give a brief history of how we got to the introduction of Vedanta into the conversation, which is now growing very well. And in fact, I will soon be starting to try and get an entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on classical Indian theories of panpsychism as it pertains and generally to philosophy of mind as a way of showing the growth in that area of research. And then I want to talk about two views of how to use Shankara's Advaita, and then an argument about why Shankara's Advaita cannot really address the hard problem of consciousness. Then I'll say why Ramanuja's Vishishta Advaita can address the hard problem of consciousness, although I will still say there that there are some ways in which it's not really appropriate for it. And then I'll close by defending what the hard problem of consciousness is in a way that I think is helpful for everyone to see something coming from Indian philosophy that could be used to attract other traditions to our problem, rather than us going with our theories towards the problems that we find in analytical philosophy or in phenomenological philosophy. Okay, so let's just start with what the definition is. And these are definitions taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. in order to show that the state of the art as defined in the place where the people go to look for what people are talking about, other than in David Chalmers' classic papers on this, it just says these things, and this is the terms we have to use. The hard problem of consciousness is to explain why and how humans and other organisms have qualia, phenomenal consciousness, or subjective experience. So that's what the problem is. It's oftentimes contrasted with the easy problems. I won't go into that contrast right now, but if you want to understand how the name hard applies to the problem of consciousness, you can look at it in relationship to what Dave calls the easy problems. Okay. What's more important to me is that there are definitions of terms that are used to characterize what we're talking about when we're talking about the hard problem of consciousness in English. And so just as when we're talking about problems in Sanskritic philosophy, we're very careful to understand what those words mean in Sanskrit, we need to understand what the words in English mean when these people are exploring their problem. So the qualitative character of experience is often equated with so-called raw feels and illustrated by the redness one experiences when one looks at ripe tomatoes, or the specific sweet savor one encounters when one tastes an equally ripe pineapple. The relevant sort of qualitative character is not restricted to sensory states, but is typically taken to be present as an aspect of experiential states in general, such as experienced thoughts or desires. So a couple of key things here is that raw feels are relevant. And number two, it is not necessarily tied to a sensory state, because there is something called cognitive phenomenology, not just sensory phenomenology. And cognitive phenomenology is phenomenology that doesn't reduce to sensory phenomenology. So we have to be careful of that distinction. Okay. Then we have something called, in this definition of the hard, the phenomenal structure of experience is richly intentional. And again, that's the key word here, and involves not only sensory ideas and qualities, but complex representations of time, space, cause, body, self, world, and the organized structure of lived reality in all its conceptual and non-conceptual forms. And then we have the subjective aspect of experience in contemporary analytic philosophy is the what it's like aspect of experience. That term was introduced by Thomas Nagel in a paper he wrote called What It's Like to Be a Bat in the 70s. Subjective experience requires a first-person point of view of what it's like to undergo the experience. The claim was that although we might try to imagine what it's like to echolocate the way that a bat can echolocate, we have no understanding from the first-person perspective of what it's like to have information processed through echolocation as a way of navigating in space. And so his core idea was that there's a what it's like aspect of experience, and that's capturing the subjective experience of it. Now, there is interesting work in analytic philosophy on exactly what the what it's like aspect of experience is in relationship to subjective experience. But the key thing I want to take away from these definitions is that the problem in analytic philosophy is basically defined in terms of the hardness of giving an account in humans and other organisms, typically non-human animals, at least us, including vertebrates, if not also invertebrates, given the research that's recently come out from NYU about invertebrate consciousness and insect consciousness. But basically, this thing, we have to control that problem in terms of the terms that are actually used. And those are the terms that I've just gone over. So we have qualitative character, we have phenomenal structure, and we have subjective what it's like aspect of experience. Okay. Now, the story begins with an initial argument that was given against physicalism by David Chalmers in roughly 1996. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I became fascinated with this problem and started doing research on it. And I'll run through the argument and explain the structure of what he's doing here. The first thing I want you to note in order to set up the end of my talk is I want you to recognize that no part of this argument mentions anything about the nature of the self. Okay, so this argument actually is absent any considerations of the self. It's just about the nature of consciousness. So the first claim is I can conceive of a zombie, a physical duplicate of myself lacking phenomenal consciousness. If I can conceive of X without Y, then it's possible for X to exist without Y. So it's possible for a zombie to exist. If physicalism is true, then it's necessarily true. That is, it's impossible for there to be a zombie, a physical duplicate of me that lacks phenomenal consciousness. So physicalism is false. So the key structure of the argument is that some kind of imaginative exercise called conceiving allows you to conceive coherently of something that is a particle by particle or piece by piece physical duplicate of yourself, but we've deleted away the consciousness that you have. So you're conscious right now. Let's say that the credence for your consciousness right now is 1. The highest credence you can give is that you're conscious now, listening to my lecture. And then what you say is, I imagine, I conceive of a duplicate of me, part by part duplicate of me, and I delete away the consciousness that I have present in my own case. And that twin of me, twin Dave, for example, lacks phenomenal consciousness, but is a physical duplicate. Then there's a move that says conceiving goes to possibility. So it's possible for the zombie to exist. And then the further interesting claim is that 4, which some people claim is the idea that physicalism, if everything is physical and reduces to the physical, then that's a necessary truth. It couldn't have been otherwise. Then given the conceivability of a zombie, we can then refute the idea that physicalism is true. Okay, so that's Dave's initial argument. And then in his initial work, he did a very nice thing. He said, okay, here's an argument. And now here are 6 ways you can react to his argument. And that articulation of these positions set up a trajectory for researchers to then spend time thinking about what was good and bad about the argument. So we'll run through quickly and we'll focus on one of them for the rest of this talk. So in the early period, most of the discussion was about type A and type B materialism. So type A materialism is the view that it is not conceivable that there be duplicates of conscious beings that have absent or inverted conscious states. So the idea is that in premise 1, you say it's conceivable that zombies exist. And in type A materialism just says, no, it's not conceivable. That's the first reaction to the argument. Type B says that zombies are conceivable, but they're not metaphysically possible, right? So these are both ways of resisting the kind of initial steps of the argument. So type A say not conceivable zombies. Type B, it is conceivable, but it's not possible. And type C says that it's conceivable for us now, but as we learn more about physics, for example, because currently we're in a state where physics is incomplete. So as we approach what's known as complete physics, or we take the position of what's known as promissory note materialism or promissory note physicalism, which says things we know right now won't be contradicted, but in the future we'll complete physics. Type C materialism is saying that in the future we won't be able to conceive of something. So all the first 3 things are about the conceivability. So in my research, in my dissertation, I basically looked at type B materialism because my hypothesis was that the theory of using 2-dimensional modal logic in David Chalmers' work to explain how conceivability is tied to metaphysical possibility is refutable by using techniques in mathematical logic. So I wrote my dissertation on just showing that the principle that says if it's conceivable, then it's metaphysically possible is false by using a technique in mathematical logic using transitive frames. So that was what my dissertation was about. It wasn't really about the consciousness part. It was just about the link between conceivability and possibility. Now, the other things on the other side of the view are called non-reductive views. So one thing is type D dualism, which is a view that in some sense is tied to Descartes' interactionist dualism. But Dave himself in his book, The Conscious Mind, defends a form of naturalistic dualism. And it's nice to contrast the dualism that Dave talks about with the kind of dualism we found in the Samkhya tradition. In fact, Karen Pop O'Brien has written a very nice paper called The Hard Problem of Pure Consciousness, where she compares the kind of dualism and consciousness that's in relationship between Purusha and Prakriti in Samkhya with what's going on in Dave's naturalistic dualism from his 1996 book. Type E is known as epiphenomenalism, and that's the idea that physical states have an effect on phenomenal properties, that is the conscious states that we have, but there's no downward causation. Consciousness doesn't have any effect on the physical, which seems weird if you agree with someone like Princess Elizabeth, who objected to Descartes and told us that basically it's not only the case that sometimes when I put my hand in the fire, I have a conscious state, but also that when I go through conscious decision-making, that conscious decision-making gets my body to move. So if you believe in upward and downward causation, then epiphenomenalism seems to be in direct contradiction with that. In dualism, the problem is how do you explain interaction causally in both directions? But type E just fundamentally denies downward causation. So the thing we're going to focus on is what is known as type F monism. On this view, phenomenal or proto-phenomenal properties are located at the fundamental level of physical reality, and in a certain sense, underlie physical reality itself. So if you sort of already know something about classical Indian philosophy, you might think, oh, Indian philosophy, aside from fitting in the camp of dualism through Sankhya, is going to fit somewhere in F. And so that's, but again, I want to point out, in the initial stage in 1996, there is no discussion of the self in setting up the hard problem of consciousness. And we'll see that again in the next argument. So then came along roughly around, I think, 2006, just after I got out of graduate school, another argument that comes from Galen Strawson. And here again, he has a very interesting way of supporting a kind of view in the type F space. So he says either consciousness is emergent from something non-conscious or it is fundamental to the universe. That's the second disjunct, is the type F case. Extension in space cannot emerge from non-extended points. We can't conceive it. What is he talking about? If you're in a Euclidean geometry, points are defined as having zero extension, but all real lines have extension. So he's saying we can't conceive of how something with no extension can aggregate together to make extended points. So we can't understand how a real line can come from something like a Euclidean point. So he thinks the emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter is like the case of extension from non-extension. So consciousness cannot emerge from non-conscious matter. So consciousness is fundamental. And then he makes this caveat, at least in the sense of micropsychism, which simply requires that at least some entities at the fundamental level are conscious. Okay, so the idea is that there's got to be something down there that's already got the property such that when we aggregate up in some way, we can get consciousness out as an emergent thing. Otherwise, we're in the case of trying to build a real line from non-extended points, and that doesn't make any sense. But again, if you look at this argument, 2 points to make. One, it doesn't mention anything about the self. Although Galen Strawson has brilliant papers about the self, in this specific argument, he doesn't make any reference to the self when talking about the emergence of consciousness. And in addition, if you look at Galen Strawson's argument, you will recognize, if you know the history of Indian philosophy, that the kind of points that he is making here are pretty much well established in a series of authors in the history of Indian philosophy. So I would at least put Sri Ramakrishna in this camp. I would put Sri Aurobindo in this camp, Swami Vivekananda in this camp. To a certain degree, I would put Abhinavagupta in this camp. I would put some other Kashmiri Shaivists in this camp. I think a lot of Indian philosophers in the classical period and later were interested already and aware of the idea that consciousness kind of has three properties. It has a constitution property. Consciousness can constitute reality. It has a generative property. Consciousness can generate reality in the emergent sense or in the non-emergent sense, in the grounding sense. And also it has the realization property. Consciousness is something that can be realized at different degrees and different levels of higher consciousness. So those three properties seem to be something that a lot of Indian philosophers were well aware of and really operated with. And it isn't really in analytic philosophy, I think, until Michael Lockwood, maybe in the 70s, but really in more clear sense in Galen Strawson in 2006, that this comes in to the discussion. So then one of the people working in this space, Sam Coleman, wrote an objection to the micropsychist position defended by Galen Strawson. And in his work, we see the first time where something about the notion of the self comes in. But notice it comes in as an objection to micropsychism, not as a positive sort of constraint on theorizing initially. So he says, micropsychism is true only if it can show how microconscious entities can combine together to make macroconscious entities like a human. Remember, the point of the hard problem of consciousness isn't to tell us that there are basic particles of consciousness at the fundamental level, but to explain how human-like consciousness, which has phenomenal structure, qualitative character, and what it's like subjective aspect, holds. So if you have micropsychism, it's not going to help unless it can explain the macro states that humans have. Then he says, in order for microconscious entities to combine to form a macroconscious entity, the perspectives of each microconscious entity must be preserved when combined. So if you're doing a combinatoric theory of aggregation, if you're aggregating these microconscious entities with either other microconscious entities or non-conscious entities, then the perspective of each microconscious entity must be preserved. And why is that? Because consciousness is, as we learned from phenomenologists, perspectival. Every conscious thing that a human has is from a certain perspective, and that perspective has to be preserved. So he says, 3, combination does not preserve perspective. And this is a very simple thing. If two people are looking at a circular object that is blue, one from perspective A and one from perspective B. When we combine their perspectives in together to form a perspective C, we will notice that logically we lose perspective A and perspective B. Perspective A and perspective B are gone when they are merged together to make perspective C. So combination as a technique of putting micropsychist entities together doesn't preserve perspectivalness. So actually those perspectives, those consciousnesses are fused together. They're not combined. And then we need a model of how fusion occurs as opposed to combination, right? It's not aggregation through combination. If anything, it's aggregation through fusion. But fusion isn't a preservation of perspective relation. So macro-conscious entities cannot be explained through combination in the sense of aggregation without fusion from micro-conscious entities. So even if consciousness is fundamental, it is not fundamental in virtue of an atomistic metaphysics of consciousness. So you can see here that something about the nature of the self perceiving at the macro-conscious level is driving the way in which we understand a constraint on why micropsychism possibly can't hold, or anything in the micropsychist. And there's a lot of interesting research now going on between scholars of Indian philosophy who want to use techniques from Buddhism. So for example, Moni Machada has a wonderful paper on micropsychism articulated in some way that voices some Buddhist philosophers. And Amit Chaturvedi is working on a response to this to understand this from the perspectives of Utpaladeva and other Buddhist people. So there's a lot of interesting work here now. Because we've introduced the notion of the self, it's sort of grappleable by like what Indian philosophers would be thinking about. Okay, so then Philip Goff came along a little bit later. He was working with all these people early on, but then he came along and made an argument for what's called cosmopsychism. He said the real combination problem occurs only if one holds it that there are micro-conscious entities that combine together to form macro-conscious entities, such as in the case of human consciousness. Atomistic metaphysics is not the only option for thinking about the fundamental level where consciousness resides. Instead, one can hold that there is a unified field of consciousness as opposed to bits of micro-conscious entities. So given the real combination problem, cosmopsychism, the view that fundamental level, there is a single unified whole consciousness, a universal consciousness seems to be a better option to pursue. The whole is prior to the parts. So Philip says basically you can avoid the real combination problem by getting rid of the attempt to have atoms of microconscious entities that are combined together through some form of non-fusion aggregation. And instead you can go to a unified consciousness. And so right about here, type F monism, which is what Dave said is one way to react to his argument, starts to look like something that is really prevalent in a lot of traditions in Indian philosophy. So cosmopsychism is a name coming from Philip Goff, and it's a kind of panpsychism according to the analytic taxonomy. And panpsychism is just sort of like literally means sort of like everything has mentality or psyche to it in some sense. And then he basically says that one way to argue for this is to use Jonathan Schaffer's technique of priority monism, which is the idea that the whole is prior to the parts, the whole grounds the part division. So this is a way of escaping this problem of constructing the self from an atomistic metaphysics that involves only micropsychist entities. Okay, and then a little bit later, Miri Albahari comes along and says, okay, well, that's true. Cosmopsychism holds that there's a unified field of consciousness from which each macro-conscious entity is derived, right? So again, we still want to explain, again, the hard problem is how do you explain human level consciousness? Well, human level consciousness is not the unified field of consciousness, it's more parochial or localized. If micropsychism faces the combination problem because of atomistic metaphysics, then cosmopsychism faces the decombination problem. How do we get from a unified field of consciousness to individual conscious minds? In order to divide down a unified consciousness, must supply each individual consciousness with its own perspective. However, a unified consciousness cannot yield a subject of consciousness unproblematically, so cosmopsychism is equally problematic. So Miri Albahari is picking up on a theme that's already in Freya Matthews called the subject individuation problem. So we'll get into that technical distinction in a moment, but I can summarize again by pointing out that Miri, actually, we're going to talk about her theory, because she's influenced a lot by Advaita Vedanta, is inserting something about the nature of the self to cause a problem for the cosmopsychist picture. So what happened is we have these two theories against physicalism and pro-fundamentality type F monism from Chalmers and Strawson. And then what happens is that Coleman and Goff and then Miri come along, and they bring in considerations about the nature of the self to drive towards other views. And so the integration of thinking about the self at a macro level, or consciousness at the level of human selves, is what drives the argument forward deeper into the space of analytic panpsychism. So we can summarize carefully. Micropsychism, how do we get from the little bits up to a unified self? And then in Cosmopsychism, how do we get from the unified field of consciousness down to the individual selves? So those are the problems that currently face analytic panpsychism. Everyone recognizes them, and in the literature they're well known. And now Indian philosophers have been spending time working on how to use theories from Indian philosophy to help explain answers to these questions. That's like a big sort of movement that's happened. I initially was part of this. I mean, I still am, but I initially helped start this movement with an article I wrote on looking at 3 types of theories in Indian philosophy and Vedanta. But I think a lot of people have taken it much further, and it's a growing area engaging Indian philosophy and comparative philosophy. So just to be clear, though, because we're going to be focusing on Cosmopsychism, because that's the one that's most closely related, in my opinion, to many theories in classical Indian philosophy, although I think you can find versions of Micropsychism in classical Indian philosophy also. There are 3 questions that oftentimes aren't distinguished in the analytical literature, but Swami Medhananda and I have discussed these 3 questions, and we agree that there are 3 different questions. So is combination or decombination modally coherent? This is like a how possible, like how is it possible for a unified field of consciousness to decompose to get the unified things, or how is it possible for combination to occur? You can do it in both directions. Then the second question is the mechanical generation question. So what if it's possible? What is the mechanism for combination or decom? What is the thing that brings about? What drives it? And then there's a metaphysical explanation question. Why does combination or decombination occur? What is it about what's going on that would make it the case that combination or decombination should occur? I mean, if something is emerging from something else, what is the explanation of the emergence in the first place? And if something is decombining down, what is it? And so what I want to clarify a distinction between what's going on in the analytic literature and what we find if we just look in the Indian philosophical literature. The analytic literature, for my part, has always been mostly focused on the first question. So if you look at the work of Philip Goff on inheritance for decombination and how inheritance can give us an account of how decombination happens, he's mostly focused on the modal coherence question. What I find, though, oftentimes is that analytic philosophers are trying to show how is it possible for something to happen through a variety of arguments. But the Indian philosophy people don't really spend a lot of time talking about that explicitly. Rather, they specifically talk about the mechanical generation question, like what is the mechanism for how this happens, and the metaphysical explanation for it. And I think that part of the reason why is because the analytic discussion, for the most part, until recently, pursues panpsychism or cosmopsychism atheistically. Well, Indian philosophy, at least in the Vedanta tradition, pursues it theistically. And so there's a current movement that has been going on for probably about 3 years where people are merging the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of mind. The next conference I'm presenting the same talk at Oxford is dedicated to showing how looking at stuff in the philosophy of religion and in Indian philosophy can help inform some of these discussions and move us away from just the modal coherence question to the mechanical generation and metaphysical explanation question. So I, and at least Swami Medhananda, agree that there's more than one question here that cosmopsychism or micropsychism faces. So Miri Albahari is probably the one person who is pushed hardest for the introduction of Advaita Vedanta into the discussion of the hard problem. The questions of combination and decombination, she claims, rest on realism about subjectivity in the self, that there is a self in some sense which is real, that we need to account for and recover. I don't think she says this explicitly, but my analysis of her work shows that there's an implicit characterization in the background. So I'll take sort of blame if this isn't really found literally in her text. However, I think she does claim if the self and subjectivity are an illusion, we merely have two competing explanations of consciousness, one proceeding from the bottom up and the other from the top down. We don't really need to explain a real self. We need to explain only the illusion of the self and subjectivity. Subjective experience is no longer in need of a real explanation because it isn't real. This changes the structure of what we're doing. So if we're looking and we're saying we have to recover a real self with real perspectives, then the job of doing that seems to me somewhat different than if what we're saying is we just have to explain the illusion of the self at a certain level of explanation and the illusion of a self at that same explanation from a different direction. So decombination goes from the unified field to an illusory self, and combination goes from elementary particles that are real to the illusion of a self and another. So we have two competing directions, but we're not solving for the real self, we're solving for an illusory self, okay? And so this is interesting, actually, because this way of seeing the illusory self and the illusory qualities maybe is something that I think is of current interest right now. So again, we'll go back to Philip Goff, but I recently was reading his most recent paper that came out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and he offers a very new theory of cosmopsychism, very different from what he defended in his book and his initial theory about decombination through inheritance from grounding. He says, I will develop a new hybrid of the strong and weak emergence forms of panpsychism. He's just talking about cosmopsychism here, really. A view according to which subjects of experience are strongly emergent, but their phenomenal properties are weakly emergent. Okay, so in some sense, I can tell you what that means. If something is strongly emergent, that leans a little bit more towards the idea that it's illusory. So subjects of experience, the self, is strongly emergent in the sense that it's kind of illusory in a certain way, but their phenomenal properties are weakly emergent because, and being weakly emergent, that they're less sort of illusory than the self. I will argue that this hybrid view manages to avoid both the challenges facing physicalism and dualism and the analogs of those challenges that seem to undermine standard forms of panpsychism. So he's going for a new view. And then I think it's actually a very interesting question. How does this sit in relation to Vedantic forms of cosmopsychism? This is an interesting and pressing question about the development of analytic cosmopsychism in relationship to Indian. So again, I would say in some sense that the move from the kind of picture that Philip had initially to this move can suggest some relationships with Vedantic theories in a closer matching relationship than actually what I'm going to argue for today as the problem. So he says nicely, according to hybrid cosmopsychism, there are basic laws ensuring that in certain conditions, new conscious subjects, new phenomenal property bearers, emerge from the universe. Now, there's a question about whether or not that means they're an illusion or not, but I generally take that grounding is a relationship where you can have the ground and the grounded both be real, but emergence is a way of saying that something in a certain sense is not real. So I didn't really track whether or not he wants the new conscious subjects to be real in a certain sense or not, but I would say that there's a way of reading a new conscious subject as being kind of emergently illusory in some sense, or being a new conscious subject that's real. But that's a detail that someone has to go through. But these strong emergent subjects do not appear with their own phenomenal property instances. Rather, they inherit phenomenal property instances which previously belonged to. So he's borrowing from his inheritance theory. That is to say, there are phenomenal properties P1, P2, Pn, and an emergent subject E, such that at a time P, T1, P2, Pn belong to the universe, and at a later time, T2, P1, P2, Pn cease to belong to the universe and instead belong to E. As E persists through time, it continues to possess a small bubble of the phenomenal properties of the fundamental fields, constantly gaining some from losing some back to the universe around the edges. At the moment, E ceases to be a conscious entity in its own right, perhaps at the death of the organism. It relinquishes its phenomenal properties back to the universe. In this way, although there are strongly emergent subjects, there are no strongly emergent phenomenal properties. Rather, phenomenal properties of the fundamental fields are transferred from the universe, subject to emergent subjects, before being relinquished back to the universe. So I don't know if you can see some of the sort of ways in which this could tie into a kind of theory and Vedantic stuff, where like each of us is a drop in the pond of the universe or the ocean of the universe. You can see something like that going on. But of course, my main claim in a lot of my talk today is that in order to work out these relationships with Indian philosophy, we need very good translations of the Sanskrit terms, and we need to be very careful about problems that can occur because things look similar at a structural level, but the details of what's going on are really not there. So going back to Miri, she says before this paper came out, like long ago, like almost 10 years ago, 2014 maybe, she says that the best way to go forward once we have the decombination problem on the table is to go to a non-dual fundamental ontology. Non-dual consciousness without a subject is fundamental and all that is real. One consequence of the lack of a subject for fundamental consciousness is that fundamental consequence is aperspectival, since perspectives attach to subjects and not to non-dual consciousness without a subject. All subjects of experience are perspectival, and as individual subjects, illusory, this is what she says. One consequence of the illusory nature of individual subjects is that their conscious experience, insofar as it attaches to their individual subjectivity, is an illusion. So she is straightforwardly advancing what she calls the perennial philosophy found in the work of Aldous Huxley, of which she thinks many traditions contribute to, and she clearly thinks Advaita Vedanta contributes to this. And the version she uses of Cosmopsychism from Vedanta is, I think, closely related to Shankara's Advaita. And according to that, we're going to at least pick out the following things. Brahman lacks qualities, lacks intentionality because it lacks the subject-object dichotomy, but is nevertheless universal, eternal, and unchanging. The individual self and the totality of what the individual self experiences is illusory, and you can put in the caveat in some sense, that's something to be figured out. And as I just said before, there is a connection to Goff's current view that is worth exploring. I'm not sure, I'm currently working on it to see exactly where it lines up with maybe some of what Shankara says, but I think there is something going on with this idea that the self is strongly emergent, but qualities are weakly emergent. We have to understand what strong emergence is and weak emergence is. Maybe Goff's view, in some sense, opposes some aspects of what Shankara goes in for, but at the same time, maybe it accepts some aspects of what he does go in for. So it's an interesting comparative project just between Goff and Shankara's Advaita, I think. That's a new thing because he just published this paper, like, I think a month ago. So witness consciousness is the core idea found in Sankhya philosophy and also in Advaita. And Albahari has a theory of it. She says witness consciousness carries an intrinsic phenomenal character, which might be described as a luminosity that is unborrowed from any particular sensory or cognitive modality. The metaphor of light to describe consciousness commonly deployed across traditions is, for instance, used contrastively by Western philosophers when describing philosophical zombies, behavior duplicates of us that lack any inner conscious life as all dark inside. Yet while taking in various sensory or cognitive imagery as direct objects of its illumination, witnessing does not illuminate itself as such as an object, but is nevertheless immediately aware of its own presence as the source. So I understand this sort of like claim about what witness consciousness is. I disagree with the idea that light is in any sense relevant here, because auditory perception doesn't have any light aspect to it. Light is a part of the visual channel. And so I can understand zombies in terms of the lack of auditory experience. So this idea of illumination and light doesn't work actually for me. So I would object to this way of characterizing what philosophical zombies are by saying all dark inside. The dark there is not really a darkness of light. I think it's something else. And I think it's same in the Indian traditions, talking about the light really isn't going to help when we're talking about the absence of what's going on in the auditory channel. So I don't think the metaphor of light is helpful here, actually. I think it's confusing to people who are not looking at the details of what might really matter. So she says this about witness consciousness and solving the hard problem. The Advaitin is left with the formidable task of explaining just how such non-dual consciousness could coherently ground our individual conscious perspectives and their contents, as well as the objects that we take to be our mind-independent environment. We can conceive of a scenario wherein one comes to experience what is an objectless mode of witness consciousness, such that it presents a subjectless and such that it presents a subjectless and aperspectival. And might such a mode of pure witnessing also present as being unconfined, by spatial, temporal, and imagistic parameters, as well as hyperreal in a way that is suggestive of its ultimacy. So she's recognizing that we have to say something more in order to make sense of this theory. And actually, what I really think is nice is that she gives an argument for how to think about witness consciousness. Now, to sort of tell you how this argument works in a way that makes sense to an analytic philosopher, I will point out that she is using a conceivability argument like David Chalmers and like Galen Strawson, and saying that if they can use conceivability arguments to make sense of a phenomenon, then it's clear that it would be okay for me to try and do that same way. But I just want to point out that I don't really find in Indian philosophy that any theorist attempts to get at this idea of witness consciousness through a conceivability argument. I don't see the use of conceivability arguments even in the defense of dualism in Indian philosophy. So Dharmakirti defends dualism by talking about what it takes for the Buddha to have infinite compassion across many lives. He doesn't use conceivability at all. He just uses the fact that the Buddha has infinite compassion and it takes more than one lifetime to have that, and therefore we have to explain it in terms of the body being sufficient for one lifetime, but not for enough lifetimes to have infinite compassion. So this is the conceivability argument she offers, and she says, although we cannot positively conceive of non-dual pure witness consciousness that is beyond space and time and all qualities, we can negatively conceive of it through a thought experiment that involves deleting what is present in perspectival object-dependent experience and what is associated with such perceptual sensory. So you put yourself in a sensory deprivation chamber and you slowly delete away all the things that you see and all the things you can feel and all the things you can hear. And she says, there is no contradiction of the form present in the claim that a circle square exists in the claim that consciousness exists without objects. If there is no contradiction in the claim, then it's prima facie negatively conceivable. So it's prima facie negatively conceivable. The consciousness without any objects can exist. So basically she's saying consciousness is not always consciousness of something, it's awareness only. And the great Acharya Stanishwar Timilsina has actually written a very nice book about the whole debate about awareness only consciousness, which I'm not citing today, but great to hear what he has to say about this. I don't think that the arguments that he would have covered in his book would cover this conceivability argument. So the idea is that this argument, I would say, like conceivability arguments, isn't really that valuable. And basically, based on my dissertation, the reason why is that, in some sense, conceivability arguments tells us what is logically or conceptually possible. But what many philosophers are interested in is what is metaphysically possible or necessary. And in my dissertation, I argued that these style arguments give us more of a wide grasp about the limits of conceptualization and logical constraints, but they don't give us access to what's metaphysically real. And because of the concern with that, I think this argument will generally fall short, even if the details here are presented very nicely. So this is my dress up of what's going on in her argument. Right, okay. So, so there's an alternative version that I recently seen came out in 2023 from 3 philosophers from India, where they actually tried to make a cosmopsychist version of Advaita Vedanta. And they say some very interesting things because they say how their view is different from Albahari's. And I think in a lot of ways, they're trying to do some additional kind of work that can help the view get off the ground. So they say, we attempt to show that the insights from Advaita Vedanta could, notice, help to address the troubles faced by Cosmopsychism. However, unlike Albahari, our approach treats Advaita Vedanta as a form of Cosmopsychism, one where the universal consciousness is not subject, but very much the source of the individual consciousness of the empirical subjects. It may be that the decombination problem as defined by Albahari does not arise for Advaita Vedanta, because when you move beyond to an aperspectival base, you walk around the problem. But according to us, Advaita Vedanta does have to address Nagasawa and Wagner's called the derivation problem, the problem explaining how the individual consciousness derived from the universe. So again, they're saying that there's still a question here, and I think that question fits in the 3 questions I asked about cosmopsychism. Their question might be in the generation issue. So they nicely say, Advaita Vedanta holds the individual consciousness to be an instance of reflection of the universal consciousness in the buddhi, the instrument of cognition possessed by sentient beings that is comparable to the modern concept of mind, with the exception that it is not considered to be intrinsically consciousness. That's the Sankhya sort of idea. The Laghu-Vakya Vritti, an Advaita Vedantic text traditionally attributed to Shankara, illustrates how an otherwise insentient buddhi is rendered conscious by illumined by the pure consciousness Brahman, and how it turns its acquires to illumine external. So again, the idea is that there's an illumination property and a light property, and the lighting up is going to do the work. So just pick up that they are picking up on another factor that is not really, is discussed in Albahari, but they're kind of pushing on this more. They say, water heated on fire acquires heat and so becomes capable of heating the body. In like manner, the intellect, illumined by pure consciousness, acquires its luster and thereby illumines all other external objects. So again, it's something about illumination is going to do the work. I'll get into this in my objections. And they say nicely, evidently the buddhi in Advaita Vedanta is presumed to be made of a special material substance, making it capable of reflecting the universal consciousness or being illumined by it. The conception of buddhi and the idea of reflection, in addition to addressing the derivation problem, allow Advaita Vedanta to explain how only the sentient beings are able to tap into the universal consciousness and not the inerrant objects, although both of them are grounded in universe. That's a very good point. That's because it's not clear actually that any Advaita Vedanta or any Vedanta view is a form of panpsychism, because according to the Indian traditions, in their views of consciousness as being fundamental, some things show up as being insentient and some things show up as being sentient. But if you had like an integrated information theory of consciousness, you might think that everything has some degree of consciousness because it has some degree of integrated information across integration and information. And so that's not the kind of view that can fit with Advaita Vedanta or any Vedanta theory. It's not like there's some degrees of consciousness in everything. In fact, what's really nicely pointed out here is that you have to have, the material has to have some other factor, which is grounded in the ultimate consciousness, but it's a factor that differentiates from being sentient and insentient. So a little bit of difference between sentience and consciousness, but at least here we can see this thing. So they say that Atmabodha, which is another Advaita Vedantic text traditionally attributed to Shankara, anticipates the question and answers that although all-pervading Atman does not shine in everything, it is manifest only in the buddhi, like a reflection in clear water on a stainless mirror. Yes, this is a very important point I also learned by studying Atmabodha with V.N. Jha a couple of years ago. Finally, they say, as Shankara writes in Kena Upanishad 2.4, Vakyabhasha, all the various thoughts, pratyaha, arising in the buddhi, which we may say are nothing but the modifications of the buddhi, are illumined by the immaterial self, which is of the nature of pure consciousness. It can therefore be said that illumination by the immaterial consciousness can explain the subjective or phenomenal quality of one's conscious states. That's a very key idea. While the material buddhi furnishes the physical base required for them to participate in the causal processes. The conception of a special material substance capable of reflecting the immaterial consciousness thus enables Shankara to bridge the gap between immaterial consciousness and the material world. As a result, Shankara's theory is able to explain mental causation without violating the thesis of completeness of physics and account for the subject character of consciousness states as well. So I'm actually very in favor of this approach that these authors have taken. I find it very interesting. And in fact, I'm currently working on trying to see how this version of Cosmopsychism squares with the new Goff theory of strongly emergent subjects and weakly emergent properties, and see what is the relationship between those two. But it's important to recognize that in the space of using Shankara, Albahari and these authors have something in common, but there's something that's different going on, and that's important that they're paying attention to subtle differences. I think there are some other people who've also written on this. Dmitry Shevchenko, I think, also at Ashoka has some stuff on also on thinking about post-Shankaran theories and how they relate. So now back to my thing. So I don't think Vedanta was interested in the hard problem of consciousness, and I think that actually the second set of authors is more clearly able to point out that we can bend the theory in a way to make it apply without saying that that's what was going on. And Albahari is a little bit less sensitive to that point, but I think she's aware of it. So we can't infer from the structural similarity between analytic cosmopsychism and various varieties of Vedantic cosmopsychism The latter always has the features relevant for addressing the hard problem. In my view, neither Sankara nor Ramanuja were interested in the hard problem of the consciousness. Nevertheless, I will argue for two positions. Sankara's theory does not fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, although as the latter authors, I think, are aware of, we can bend it to do so as part of fusion philosophy, and then we can question what's the value of that kind of fusion. Ramanuja's theory does fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, but then we must accept a theistic solution to the hard problem, and I think that's fine. But also, I think Ramanuja, even though he fits the frame, that doesn't mean he's going for that kind of thing. And my own work has been on defending Ramanuja as fitting the frame. I have like a whole paper dedicated to that. So Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is basically categorically inappropriate to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Why? In Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, fundamental consciousness lacks qualities, it's nirguna, lacks intentionality, there's no subject-object dichotomy, and 3, there are no real subjects of experience, right? They're illusions. The hard problem is focused on the explanation of qualia in subjective experience that is intentional, subjective, and for subjects of experience that are real. So Advaita needs to show how intentionality and qualities arise for subjects of experience and why intentionality and qualities arise for subjects of experience. And I think Advaita does have something to say about that. I'm not going to say in this talk whether I think those are very coherent answers, but I definitely think they have something to say about it. So maybe we can look to and make an analogy between some analytic theories and Shankara's view to get some help from analytic philosophy. So Panqualityism is a view in analytic philosophy, whereas panpsychists think that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. Pan-protopsychists think that proto-consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. The properties that characterize conscious experience are commonly referred to as phenomenal properties, and hence the properties involved in proto-consciousness are referred to as proto-phenomenal properties. Panqualityism is the view that proto-phenomenal properties are unexperienced qualities. So there are these qualities that are proto-phenomenal, but they're unexperienced. They don't have a subject. Whereas panpsychism hold that the world is filled with experienced qualities, those phenomenal qualities involved in seeing color or feeling pain, Panqualityists believe that such qualities are only contingently experienced, and that in basic matter they exist on it. So that looks like it's cutting the subject-object dichotomy, but now if we go carefully to the argument, I don't think it works. Panqualityism requires that phenomenal consciousness is fundamental, and 2, that there are genuine qualities at the fundamental level that exist unexperienced. Advaita Vedanta maintains that pure consciousness at the fundamental level exists unexperienced by anyone, and fundamental consciousness is without qualities. So Advaita Vedanta captures 1 of Panquality, but it fails to capture 2, because again, it's nirguna. So the illumination of the light is an illumination of a light with a pure quality. It's not the illumination of all, it's not the capturing of all the qualities that are already there. Panqualityism is positing the qualities at the fundamental level. It's not positing that it's illumination alone that gets these things off the ground. So there's something tricky that has to be done to get that to work. I don't see it working out. And then Angela Mendelovecki has defended a view known as phenomenal intentionality. And her view is that from pure phenomenology, we can generate intentionality. Now, this might be thought to help Shankara's Advaita because, again, we can talk about witness consciousness, as Albahari pointed out, as having this pure phenomenal character, although I claim I don't really understand how that is going on there, because if she's just talking about illumination, it's the light analogy again. And so then we can argue that maybe if the analytic movement of pure phenomenology can generate intentionality, then we can go pure witnessing consciousness has this phenomenology, phenomenal character, and that's sufficient to generate it. That's the point of Angela Mendelovecki's book in Analytic Philosophy. However, it cannot, because pure consciousness at best has only bliss as a quality, which again can be thought to be contradictory. How is it Shankara is saying that it's nirguna and then it has a quality of bliss, ananda? I actually have an argument about how he can defend that view, but clearly it's kind of a tension. In order to create the rich palette of conscious experience, we need a plethora of phenomenal qualities that can serve as the basis for intentionality. The overall approach can work in analytic philosophy, but I don't think it can work for Shankara's Advaita because, again, we have the nirguna problem. So we should now say that there are good things that actually Advaita does. We don't want to say that what's going on here is bad all the way down, because it's not. So it does answer the modal coherence question. It holds that individual subjects are illusory, but that non-dual pure consciousness is real. It answers the mechanical generation question. It holds that ignorance is what generates illusory subjects and their experience. I'm not clear on whether it answers the metaphysical explanation question. It does not say why ignorance covers pure consciousness. I think when you look at people like Sri Aurobindo and his involution theory that Swami Medhananda has defended about how he answers the decombination problem or the subject individuation problem, we get a better picture of why it is the case that something is done. I don't know in what sense Shankara can say a story of why we get decombination or subject individuation. And I don't think the authors of the paper from the Indian authors actually address that issue as much. They're more concerned with the first two, I think. All of this just acknowledges where it gives and might not give answers, but not whether these answers are satisfying. I don't think Shankara's answers are satisfying here, but that's because I have more realist commitments that favor other theories. So finally, my view would be that the hard problem is about intentional consciousness, consciousness that is directed, as Brentano says, all consciousness is consciousness of something. Advaita Vedanta holds that only consciousness that is real is non-dual consciousness, where there is no subject or object and no qualitative phenomenal or intentional structure. And by that, I mean it doesn't have the intentional structure that is defined by the subject-object dichotomy. There could be another notion of intentional structure. I'm just not clear what that could possibly be. And also, I'm reflecting the fact that after giving various accounts of Shankara to various analytic philosophers over a decade, that many of them also find it very hard to understand what this is. Almost uniformly, it's a technical question that requires some work. So Shankara's Advaita account of a real consciousness does not apply to the hard problem, really. There are similarities between what he's doing, and we can bend it, but I don't really think it does. Strangely and interestingly, though, his view seems to be completely consistent with a dissolution to the problem that is offered by Keith Frankish, known as illusionism about consciousness. So in my view, actually, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is actually a valuable companion to Keith Frankish's view. In Advaita Vedanta, only that which is permanent or beyond time is fundamental. In Advaita Vedanta, only that which is fundamental is real. So in Advaita Vedanta, only that which is permanent or beyond time is real. Conscious states of macro subjects are not permanent in time. Ownerless, subjectless, non-dual consciousness is permanent in or beyond time. So non-dual consciousness is fundamental. Dual consciousness is not fundamental. So conscious states of macro subjects are a mere illusion. This seems to me the Shankaran argument for illusionism about subject level consciousness. And that's precisely the position that Frankish argues for, but he doesn't do through this argument. So there's a deep connection there. Okay, now going on to someone who I think does work. So really quickly, in Ramanuja, there's a distinction between Brahman, pure consciousness without attributes, nirguna, and Brahman, pure consciousness with attributes, saguna. Shankara only accepts Brahman, pure consciousness without as being real. Any attributes of Brahman are in appearance only. Ramanuja accepts both. So I already think Ramanuja is closer. In Ramanuja, the Supreme Person is constituted by consciousness and has consciousness. Consciousness without a self is impossible. In Shankara's consciousness without a self is possible, since Brahman is pure consciousness, that make harder. I think Ramanuja agrees with Brentano that all consciousness is consciousness of something by a subject of consciousness. Sankara seems to strongly disagree with Brentano, and that's the point of the project of making sense of pure witness consciousness. Ramanuja's theory, in classical Indian metaphysics, there's a distinction between a mode and the mode possessor. For example, the color of a rose and the rose that possesses the color. In Ramanuja, the kind of metaphysical dependence between a mode and its possessor is used to hold that the Supreme Person is strictly distinct from each conscious finite self and all non-conscious matter, even though they are inseparable from the Supreme Person. Shankara holds that Brahman is strictly identical to each finite self, which then, as a result, leads to the conclusion that each finite self is identical to each other, which some people could think is a problem. Shankara's use of strict identity, that's why I just said, leads to the view that all of us are ultimately identical to each other and to Brahman, which can lead to a problem depending on what you think about the metaphysics there. Ramanuja's theory, again, Ramanuja disagrees with Shankara over how the criterion for real should be used. For Sankara, everything that passes in time is unreal/illusory. Impermanence is the mark of unreality. For Ramanuja, impermanence does not entail unreality. For example, both material bodies and conscious finite selves are temporally bound and impermanent, qua material bodies and finite selves, yet they are and inhabit a different kind of reality than what the Supreme Person inhabits. Ramanuja accepts that there are different ways of being real that do not show that something is less real, but rather only real in a different way. I think there are different interpretations of Ramanuja and Sankara on this point. We can discuss it in Q&A. Upshot, Ramanuja, unlike Sankara, holds that intentional structure and qualities are fundamental and real. The realism aspect of Ramanuja's view makes his view applicable to solving the hard problem of consciousness. Sankara's view is at best a dissolution via the illusionism strategy of the decombination problem that requires still an answer to the subject individuation question. And so in that sense, I think some of the properties that Ramanuja has fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness clearly better than Sankara in my view. But I would back off by saying that was what Ramanuja was all about. It's rather that if you accept his theism and you think then you can get an answer to the modal coherence, the modal generation, and the metaphysical explanation, this view is coming closer into giving a solution as opposed to a dissolution to the hard problem of consciousness. Okay. But this is all a way of saying that we shouldn't be talking about this maybe, or we should add to the discussion the thing that Indian philosophers really were talking about. Indian philosophers were interested in the hard problem of the self. That's the name I give it. How is the self related to fundamental reality, which is consciousness? I think many Indian schools and thinkers go in for this kind of question and frame, not only Vedanta, but Kashmiri Shaivism, various schools of Buddhism, maybe Yogacara. I'm unclear about that. Sri Ramakrishna for sure, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo all seem to be people who go in for this. Many Indian philosophers debated this by considering illusionism and realism about the self in relationship to consciousness as fundamental reality. The leading question is, which illusion, if any, should we accept in a unified theory of self and consciousness in relation to fundamental reality? And following David Chalmers, who has been a big influence in my philosophical career, I created my own list of options, which I call the asymmetric positions and the symmetric positions. So my view would be that just as his argument leads to 6 positions we can consider, my question leads to 4 questions we consider, which I think already are explored in Indian philosophy. Type S illusionism is illusionism about the self and realism about consciousness. I think that's pretty much an Advaita position. I think there's type C illusionism, where there's realism about the self and illusionism about consciousness. I think there's a version of thinking about Charvaka, which would make it the case that it fits in that camp. Then there's type D illusionism, illusionism about the self and illusionism about consciousness. Maybe Yogacara fits, I'm not sure yet, but I think some school of Buddhism is going to fit in this camp because Jay Garfield has argued both for illusionism about the self and illusionism about consciousness in his work on Buddhism. So I know some Buddhism school fits. I'm just not sure that Yogacara is the right one. And then obviously I think type R realism, which is the one I go in for, realism about the self and realism about consciousness, is a view found in Ramanuja and in Vishishta Advaita. So I think this is a framework that we can adopt, and then we can say, what does analytic philosophy and phenomenology have to say about this problematic in Indian philosophy? Instead of saying, oh, there's a problematic in Indian philosophy, in analytic philosophy, let's bend all of our theories to sort of fit this thing that we were never really discussing. Let's try to draw people into the thing that clearly we were discussing, because as we see in analytic philosophy, there's been a progression to include discussions of the self in relationship to consciousness to generate problems and theories now. But that was all along what was going on in classical Indian philosophy. We were always thinking about this because the project of a darshan is to give a unified account across many different parameters, not to piecemeal give a theory of consciousness and the self. So someone like Derek Parfit gives a big theory of the self, but no theory of consciousness. And David Chalmers gives a big theory of consciousness, no theory of the self. Galen Strawson gives a theory of the self and the theory of consciousness, but he doesn't always connect them together. And so the question is, in Indian philosophy, this was never really going on. I think they don't piecemeal cut things apart and separate them in that analytic way. They try to have a unified account. And I think this framework, which is superior, I've defended for at least 3 or 4 papers, I think clearly should draw people to the conversation in Indian philosophy. So the Indian concern with the hard problem of the self can draw theories of the self into conversation with theories of consciousness and fundamental reality. We need not accept the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, which rests on Chalmers' zombie argument, which I think is completely foreign to Indian philosophy, where the options are generated only in relation to rejecting the steps in an argument that does not mention the self at all and has not used it. And that's not a way of saying that Dave's work is unvaluable. In fact, I find myself spending a lot of time working on that problem. But I don't think that we should think this is the main problem only that we should be focusing on. Rather, we should push for the hard problem of the self into the space and draw other traditions towards us so that we're not always like working in their framework. The hard problem of the self serves as an attractive frame for debating the self, consciousness, and fundamental reality that draws other traditions to Indian philosophical problems. So sorry for the long talk. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.